Good evening, class. My name is Brian Quintero, and the topic I focused on for my final research paper was the Middle Passage. Now, this is more on chapter 2 of our African American Odyssey, and the Middle Passage is the forced transplantation of Africans to the American continent. Now, this happened between the 16th and 19th centuries, and it was one part of the major transatlantic slave trade. The reason I selected this topic was because I wanted to know more about the African American culture. Before this class or anything, I didn't know anything about the Middle Passage. I knew a little bit of it, but in grade school, books don't really go over that. There's been a couple books that say things like slaves wanted to come here or slaves only came to help. I think in a lot of history books it's sugar-coated, and I wanted to figure out the whole aspect of the Middle Passage myself, thus being the reason why I chose this topic. It contributes to African American history because just overall, it is history. And it's the start of the African American history. None of the Africans wanted to be here. None of them asked to be here. And the fact that they were forced to stay here, they were chosen as property. It makes me think that there's really cruel people, and I just wanted to educate myself on this topic a little more and educate others. Now, the 5 major points for my research are how Africans were accustomed to slavery before the Middle Passage. Now, before Europeans came to Africa and figured out that they were going to use Africans as slaves, it was already going on between them. And for thousands of years, Africans were already being exploited for indentured servitude. Now, it wasn't quite slavery, but it was just not the same as the slavery that Americans used them for. Another point is why Africans were needed for slavery. Now, when the Industrial Revolution in America was expanding, there was a lot of goods that America was producing. However, there was not a lot of labor to make those goods. So, given that Europeans had already opened that Atlantic slave trade with the indentured servitude, they saw an opportunity to use Africans as labor workers. And that's why they were needed for slavery, because they were producing cotton, tobacco, rice, sugarcane. Those raw goods were used to make like rum, cigarettes, clothing, all of that. Another point is how they got captured. I remember reading in a source that I came up across. A lot of these Africans were caught between interethnic rivalries between two city-states, however you want to call it. And so basically, the Europeans found an opportunity to try to use the villagers as people to use for slaves. And so that what they would do, they'd use their weapons, and they'd give them to one portion of the two groups that were fighting, and in exchange they would make them fight with their weapons, and the captives would be sent so that they can be used for slavery. And once they were captured, they had to, depending on where they were at, they walked hundreds of miles to the coast where they were rounded up in pens and awaiting for merchants to come and buy them. Now, another portion of my research was the conditions on the ship. Alluda goes into depth about the environment of the ship. Now, since the slaves were shackled underneath the deck, they were typically huddled up like a can of sardines. It was very overcrowded. There was a lot of diseases going around, and there was just a really unjust form of treatment throughout everything, because even the crew members they just had a really bad perception of these African people. They didn't even look at them as humans. They would look at them more so as if, ranchers now look at cattle or something. They didn't have any connection towards them. And the conditions on the ship, like like I said, they treated them bad. My last and final point of the project was how the slave trade ended. The slave trade ended in 1807 because of numerous counts of abolitionists trying to end slavery. They finally succeeded. This really impacts me because, as a minority in this country, I know my background and I know where I came from, but I don't think African Americans can say the same. They can't even trace their family tree or anything because of everything that has happened to them. The Americans have erased almost everything that they created here in the United States. It's very impactful, and overall, I learned a great deal in this course, and more so this paper that I wrote. So yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you.